Hello, everyone. Welcome to our module on water, soil, and earthworks. And this is just a little introductory video to go over some of the big stuff and explain why I have put them together and how we are going to learn how to create an interconnected water, soil, and earthworks system on your permaculture site. So thanks for being here, and let's go ahead and jump in. All right, dirt first, water next, always on contour. Let's go through those one at a time. So dirt first means you need to understand as much as you can about your soil. It's, if you remember the scale of permanence, it's one of the things that's the hardest to change, and the things that you change about it last the longest. So it's actually pretty easy to mess up your soil very quickly, but then it takes a really long time to build it back. So something as simple, as foolhardy of an action as like tilling it when it's too wet can really mess up your soil for years to come. So you need to really prioritize learning about soil if you want to succeed as an organic gardener in general, and definitely as a permaculture designer. So learn about the dirt, learn about your dirt, and learn how to best protect it and preserve it. And then water, of course, is essential to life and essential to agriculture, and we need to understand how it moves and how to work with it and how to keep it on site, and depending on where you live in the world, and we'll get into that. And these are the foundations. This is where it starts. And then always on contour, this means that we learn the lay of the land, and we learn how to direct the dirt. We learn how to lay the dirt in a way that doesn't blow away. We learn how to direct the water so that it protects the dirt. We learn how to lay the dirt so it protects the water. It all interconnects, and that's where strategies like earthworks come in. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in this slideshow as well. So dirt first, water next, always on contour. It's kind of like a little mantra to serve as a learning tool for you as you're walking around and you're assessing these sites. This is a very easy little tool to remember. Okay, big soil. So if you've done permaculture courses before, you might have heard of the term big water. And a lot of times when we teach water, we talk about big water, little water. And I just wanted to also include that perspective of big soil, little soil, because I think it's something we talk often about: water shortages. I mean, just in community, it comes through in the news. But soil shortages and soil erosion is really not at the center of the conversation, and it really should be, because it's just as important of an issue. And also the issues are completely interconnected. So this 24 billion tons of soil lost annually. 30% of Earth's land is degraded or eroded, which means that we can't use it for agriculture. You could maybe pave it over and use it for apartment buildings, or I don't know, solar farms, right? But it's degraded, and a lot of it is just in the ocean. So a lot of this ends up becoming sedimentation, and that causes all sorts of problems with water quality and aquatic habitat and clogging waterways and contaminating nutrients. There's so many things. There's so many problems caused by us tilling up the soil and blowing it over into the ocean. It's not a good pattern for us to be creating. And if you look, if you Google it, you can see that a lot of the world's beaches are disappearing because we're not participating in the natural cycle that creates more sand, and then, natural little bits of erosion, and then the land builds itself back up with organic matter from falling leaves and decomposing bits of life, and then, the water cycle replenishes itself. We're not participating in that in a sustainable fashion. So the earth is changing a little bit more quickly than perhaps it should be. And a lot of that, the lion's share of that, is because of industrial agriculture and mining. And a lot of the mining is because of our electronics consumption, of course, and because of our fuel and our petrochemical addiction. So this is stuff that we have to think about. If we're to behave in environmental, ecological fashion, if we're to move forward as ecological designers, we have to think about soil in terms of the global crisis that it is, just like water. Now, the conversation about little soil is a bit more exciting and empowering, because that's when we start getting into what we can actually do. Some of the big soil stuff is a lot, right? It's overwhelming, and we try to make good some consumer choices, and we try to pay attention and stay informed, but really it's the work that we do in our own backyards that we have the most control over. So that's the little soil section, and that's what most of the soils lesson in this module is really going to focus on, is helping you understand the soil food web, figure out how to design a sustainable soil system at home so that you're not part of the problem and instead are part of the solution and creating regenerative cycles within the land that you do have access to. So I'm not going to go into much detail about that right now because we've got a whole lesson for that in this module. So moving on to big water. Let's talk about that for a minute. All right, remember when we talked about fractals and how every ecosystem is an ecosystem within an ecosystem? So the global water cycle is a really excellent example of how these patterns manifest on multiple scales. Because as you can see in the diagram, the water cycle is fairly basic. It's just the water goes up, the water changes form, the water comes down, the water moves around, the water goes up again. And it's really entirely up to us whether or not it collects contaminants on the way. And every time it does, it becomes water that we can't use as well in the future. So if we're not contaminating the water, so this is what water loss means. It's not actually going anywhere. We're staying with it, but our watery world is just getting dirtier and dirtier. So that's sort of the problem. And you can see, the cycle just goes round and round and around. The water doesn't go away. The dirty water never leaves. And this is the type of cycle that we'll try to mimic in our home system. So we'll get into that in a second. So this slide has some sort of very ugly and scary numbers, and just take a moment to contemplate these numbers and to think about the ways that we could solve a lot of these problems already with the resources that we already have today as a society. So if you're motivated to get involved politically and to try to provoke change in your local watershed and then expanding out from there, or even just to go for it on a national level, I really encourage you to do that, because there are some serious policy changes that could really help what's going on with water pollution in the world today. There's a lot of over extraction and land use and infrastructure problems that could be solved relatively quickly with the right types of organizations and people making change. So meanwhile, big water is another one of those overwhelming things, and you have to be careful not to get caught up in the gloom and doom of it to the point of inaction. So just giving you these numbers to contemplate, and we'll move on. So before we cut you loose from the doom and gloom section and move into little water, I wanted to bring some numbers that are pretty intense. So when I first published Food Not Lawns in 2006, I had done the research and discovered that 1 billion people at that point on the planet lacked access to safe water. It was not possible for them to just easily access drinking water. They had to have bottled water, etc. So that number now has doubled in the last less than 20 years. And they expect it to double again by 2025 to the point where 2/3 of the global population does not have access to clean water. So some of these numbers are irreversible. We are not, even with the technology that we have right now, the way that things are going. It reminds me of that Bill Mollison quote of if we don't change our direction, we will wind up where we are headed. And that is the very real situation that we're looking at now, is that we have not changed our direction with the way that we consume these resources. And now we're to the point where most of us, by 2025, most of us won't have access to clean water. And that is a problem. So let's get on board. Let's make it happen. Let's jump into the little water piece of the puzzle. Okay, now I mentioned the watershed, and this is what that is. So the watershed could sort of be considered medium water. It's where your water comes from, and it's where your water goes. You think about whether it comes from up in the mountains or from a local spring, or if you have a farm and it comes from a well, but how does it get into that well? So start thinking about the water as it comes out of your sink and trace it back. Find out where it originally came from. Consider that sort of a side assignment for your homework. And honestly, it should be part of your site assessment to figure out where your water comes from and where your water goes. And your goal as a designer on site is to keep the water on site as long as possible, unless of course there's too much water, which is the case in some circumstances, in which case you figure out how to cycle it around or how to get it off the site in a way that is ecological and doesn't cause erosion further down in the watershed. So this slide includes a lot of text. These components: connectivity, runoff, conservation, local impact, and planning. These are the things we consider. So the watershed, the definition of the watershed is just the water itself and its interaction with the land, and rivers, lakes, infiltration, groundwater storages. The water itself is the watershed. Okay, and that connects to the larger to the larger bioregion and out into the global water cycle. And as I mentioned, there's fractal patterns. So these cycles are repeating on every scale. And you want to imitate a watershed on your permaculture site. If you can wrap your head around that, then designing for the water becomes very easy. And you can even, in a lot of courses, in live courses, what we love to do is to create these little sandboxes where you can kind of make like a mock-up of your site in 3D and then pour water on it and start to learn how the water moves. And that can really help you to visualize it when you're actually working on the full scale. So I strongly recommend all of you to create a kind of water design sandbox and start to learn how water moves, because it doesn't always move the way you want it to. And that's what we'll use earthworks and berms and contours to help direct the water either away from the site if there's too much of it, or to keep it on if there isn't enough. And we're going to get into that in this other lesson in the module. But the things that you really consider when you're studying your watershed is what's on this slide. So these components, you're going to consider the land and the plants, because they're going to have to do with how quickly the water moves through the land. You're going to think about the connectivity of which parts of the watershed are perhaps not being managed as efficiently, either naturally or by the local agencies, and so on. So there's a lot to consider here in terms of when big water starts to become little water and this sort of medium water idea. And I probably should have labeled this slide medium water, but I want you to really start thinking about how the big stuff that's overwhelming, that feels impossible to conquer, can translate into the little stuff that you do have control over. And here we go. So soil and water sustain ecosystems together. They are intrinsically interconnected, living systems that interact and influence each other, constantly changing, and our human life is utterly dependent on the interplay of these systems. And they also influence each other in some really observable ways. And I encourage you to get out there and try to witness this, because it's going to help you get connected and help you to understand this interplay. And that's what this slide is about, which is a few things that you can start looking for, a few things that you can start thinking about in terms of how soil and water sustain ecosystems together. The point is to work with nature rather than against it. So first thing you have to do is understand how nature works. And that's what this interplay and what this module is about. So we're going to get into more of these details as we continue. And that brings me to the really fun part. So earthworks, which is sort of one of the favorite things that people talk about in permaculture. Everybody loves a swale, everybody loves a hugelkultur. And I think that that's because they help us to really make tangible that connection between the earth and the design, and between the soil and the water. And we use the earthworks to move nutrients around site, and to put the water where we want it, and to keep the soil from blowing away. And it's all interconnected, and there's lots of different types of strategies that we can use. Even if you have a very small site, you can use little miniature versions of earthworks to maximize the potential. So we're going to get into that also in the last lesson of this module. And this slide is just to say that that's earthworks is sort of the magical place where we bring soil and water together. I'm really excited to share that part of the module with you. So let's jump into it here pretty quick. Now, as you move into this next phase of starting to learn the real hands-on, tangible skills of how to manage your soil and your water and the contours of your land, consider that every inch of soil, every drop of water is teeming with life. And that every drop of water inside of you and every cell inside of you is teeming with microorganisms. We are very much a part of this community, and it is very much a part of us. So as you move forward, I hope that you will consider that the easiest thing to do is to work with nature rather than against it. It's literally what we were born to do. See you in there.